Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. In today's episode of the Social Work Podcast, we're diving into a topic that's often glossed over in social work education: neurobiology and the brain. Now, on one hand, it makes sense. A lot of folks who go into social work didn't exactly love biology in college. They didn't really choose majors like biology, or they didn't go into nursing or medicine because anatomy and physiology wasn't their thing. But here's the paradox. One of the few things that is universally true across all direct practice social work is that we're trained to do the biopsychosocial spiritual assessment. It's something we learn in our very first semester of social work school. And the first word in that mouthful, bio, as in biology. So it's kind of wild that we often gloss over the biological part, especially the brain. We assume that we're going to outsource the biological side of the assessment. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone. And if you need proof, check out the second episode I ever published on the Social Work Podcast back in January 22nd, 2007 on biopsychosocial spiritual assessment. It's been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. I was very proud of it. But looking back on it for this introduction, I realized that I included, wait for it, just a single sentence on the biological. I said, quote, "For bio, we're looking at your basic needs: food, shelter, clothing, medical, health, physical capabilities in a physical environment." Like, I didn't even mention the brain. But today's guest, Dr. Jim Marley, associate professor, former interim dean at Loyola University Chicago School of Social Work, and a veteran social worker with over 40 years of experience, explains that understanding the brain is not optional, especially if we want to be taken seriously on interdisciplinary teams, practice trauma-informed care, and help clients make sense of diagnoses and medications. In today's interview, we talk about how trauma literally writes itself into the brain, why understanding neuroplasticity gives hope to clients who feel stuck, the importance of being a critical consumer of neuroscience headlines, in part because clients read them too, and we got to do some translation, and how social workers, often the first to hear about new symptoms or medication side effects from clients, can respond with confidence and compassion. We also get into brain basics, structures like the prefrontal cortex, limbic system, neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, and how medications like SSRIs trick the brain into adjusting. And yes, we talk about how social workers can talk about the medical side of medication without talking beyond our training, including the neurobiology of side effects, withdrawal, and why you shouldn't go cold turkey off your meds. So if you've ever felt underprepared to talk about the brain or wondered why it matters for your practice, this episode is for you. Now, a couple of notes about today's episode. Dr. Marley and I spoke in 2016. So why am I publishing an interview 9 years after I recorded it? Well, the interview was fantastic and has been listened to by thousands of bachelor's and master's students at Loyola University Chicago School of Social Work. Indeed, there are several excellent interviews that Loyola students have access to as part of their social work education that I haven't made public, but the information that Dr. Marley shared is so good and continues to be relevant that I wanted to share it with everyone here. And Jim approved. Also, because the episode was recorded in 2016, some of the dates he mentions are a little, out of date. Another thing to know is that in the interview, you'll hear me talk about the occipital lobe as yellow. I feel the need to give you a little context. So when I was 12, I wasn't doing so well in my biology class. Didn't do so well in bio, chose social work. Interesting. Might want to think about that. My uncle, Ron Singer, is a chiropractor, and he gave me Gray's Anatomy coloring book to help make learning anatomy and physiology more fun. So I had a box of crayons and decided to color the occipital lobe yellow. During the conversation, when Dr. Marley mentions the part of the brain, I pictured my Gray's Anatomy coloring book and the back of the brain that I colored yellow. So that's why I call it yellow. It has nothing to do with anything except my decision to pick up a crayon when I was 12 and color something in yellow. Oh, and yes, the title of the TV show Gray's Anatomy is a pun based on the Gray's Anatomy textbook. And now you know. And now, without further ado, on to episode 147 of the Social Work Podcast, Neurobiology for Social Work, an interview with Dr. James Marley. So, Jim, thanks so much for being here on the Social Work Podcast and talking with us today about neurobiology and the brain.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
So, one of the things that we tell social work students is, the biopsychosocial spiritual assessment is really like the bread and butter of what we do when we think about what's going on with someone. And we also say, look, you're not a trained medical professional, and so there are a lot of things that we need to know medically, but we sort of outsource them, right? And so what do social workers need to know about the brain and why?
Well, if we start with the why question first, a couple of things come to mind. I think initially there is so much going on with the brain across the lifespan, and there is so much information out there that really impacts how social workers think about their clients at most ages of development, that I think if you're going to be at the table talking with other professionals, interdisciplinary teams, you need to be able to talk some of the language, have some sense of what's going on when issues of neurobiology, neurological issues come up. And I think it's been a issue in the training of social workers that very often it's kind of piecemeal what we get. I know in my own training, it was really not until sort of like postmaster's individual interest that I sort of got caught up with everything that I had missed out on in the area of neurobiology. So if we're going to be active participants at the table in mental health, behavioral health, healthcare issues across the lifespan, we have to have at least an ability to communicate with other professionals. I think the other big issue in social work of the brain is obviously the large influence on the extensive research now on trauma. And trauma and how trauma writes itself into the brain, how trauma affects the brain, again, at various points in the lifespan. I know many people get trained in sort of trauma-informed care and interventions, but the under part of all of that is really understanding what trauma is doing to the brain, how the brain responds to trauma, and what that might then mean for the kinds of interventions you might want to think about. I think third, and this might come as a surprise to some people, over the last couple of decades, as I've been involved in stuff related to brain, the picture within social work and stuff related to the brain is much more positive than it used to be.
What do you mean by that?
I think there was a sense, when I think back to my own training and getting involved, that it was sort of like the brain was the brain, and whatever happened to it, you were sort of stuck. And, you peaked around 25, and it was downhill after that.
I hope not.
Yeah, I hope not too. But I think when you start looking at some of the research on the flexibility and the plasticity of the brain, the ability of the brain to recover different interventions, whether we're talking about, again, psychosocial interventions or biological interventions, I think there's a lot more optimism about brain health across the lifespan. And even when you're dealing with folks with what might be considered significant kind of neurobiologically based issues like psychotic disorders or other kinds of disorders like that, I think there's, from my read of the research, a lot more kind of optimism about the brain. So I know in the past I've had clients say like, well, we used to call this a mental illness. Now we're supposed to call it a brain disorder. What good is that to me? In some ways, they felt more empowered thinking it was a mental disorder. And when they heard brain disorder, they sort of felt like there was nothing that could be done.
Oh, that's interesting. So it was like they were seeing mental as something that was sort of within their control, but brain is an organ.
Brain is an organ, and once it's doing whatever it's doing, there's nothing to be done. And so they actually didn't feel good about that. They didn't feel like there was much of an empowerment perspective of that. And I could certainly empathize with that because people think there's not much you can do to the brain. But I think as the research has moved forward, we're seeing a lot more emphasis on understanding the way the brain responds to things, and starting to see a lot of research showing how the brain can in fact change, heal, respond based on the kinds of interventions. Going back to what you said at the beginning about the biopsychosocial spiritual assessment, one of the things that I think social work has always grappled with and embraced is the issue of complexity, that people and the systems we live in are very complex. And one of the things you'll hear frequently in research on the brain, people will frequently use the term things that are necessary but not sufficient.
Right.
So that when you're looking at someone with let's say a significant mental health problem, you might say, well, there's the brain is playing some role in that, so we have to be able to talk about the brain, but we can't just talk about the brain. So you oftentimes will hear that whole, it's necessary to talk about the brain, but it's not sufficient to only talk about the brain when we're talking about complex people and their systems. So I think for all those reasons, it's helpful for social workers to learn some of the language, be able to engage in the dialogue, and at least learn how to be reasonable consumers of the literature out there. Part of the difficulty is when research comes out on brain research, it's usually fairly complicated technical research, which then gets oversimplified into media blurbs. And very often people read the media blurbs and think, wow, we've stumbled onto something amazing. And then you have to go back and dig into the research and find out, it was based on research with 5 mice. And there's a little lag time between the media blurbs and what's actually going to be helpful. So people need to be good interpreters of the literature so they don't get sucked into overblown claims that frequently happen with brain research.
And that would certainly be something that social workers should be able to do for their clients, as opposed to expecting clients to be like, I saw this headline, but I went back to pediatrics and I read that article, or I saw that thing in Nature, and I disagree with those methods, or something like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, people, our clients read the newspaper, our clients watch the news, they hear, the latest breakthrough. And if you're a social worker in a healthcare setting and you're working with families that are dealing with, say, like Alzheimer's, and suddenly something comes out in the news, they're like, breakthrough in Alzheimer's treatment. And suddenly you have your clients calling you up saying, when can you get my family member signed up? And then you go back to the research and realize, okay, this is a small finding. It's important, but we're talking 5 to 10 years before any practical application. You're not doing a disservice to your families that you're working with, but you are trying to help them understand the realities of what's available.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that social workers need to understand about the brain, and some concepts and terms, so that they can actually be intelligent, informed folks at the table?
I don't think social workers need to drill down to the level of a neurosurgeon or a neurobiologist. But when you think about the brain, there's a couple of ways of thinking about the brain that have some direct applications with clients and the work that we do with clients. I oftentimes, when I talk about this with students, I'll say, imagine that you can take the top of your head off and look down at your brain. And it's kind of an unremarkable mass down there. And I think what's interesting is we're so used to opening up textbooks and seeing things that are color-coded and labeled and all the different pieces are sort of like different colors. Brain doesn't look like that.
Right. You mean the vision part of my brain is not yellow?
No. And there aren't little tabs with little arrows pointing out different things. And in fact, when people talk about different parts of the brain, when you look at the actual slides of brains or maps of kind of what the brain looks like, the differentiations are oftentimes just minute. And I think it's surprising. I think people get surprised when they look at actual brains. And usually what you're seeing when you take off the top of your head and you're looking down is what you notice initially is just the two hemispheres and what are called the gyrus and the sulcus. These are the hills and valleys of the brains, the folds and the little canyons of the brain. But when you talk about the brain and the research on the brain, what most people already know from previous education they may have had about the brain is you've got a variety of lobes in the brain. You've got the frontal lobe, which sits right behind your forehead. You've got the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe. And these all have different parts to play in what is going on with clients. Those different lobes control different actions of the body. The one that probably is most frequently talked about in the research related to mental health issues is very often the frontal lobe, the one that sits right behind your forehead, and in particularly what's referred to as the prefrontal cortex, which is the very outside of that part of your brain. This is considered the part of the brain that manages things like higher level executive functioning, decision making, problem solving, things like that. And you will find in a lot of research on folks who are struggling with different kinds of mental health issues, a lot of interest in the prefrontal cortex. It's often a surprise to people when they think about it that the occipital lobe, which is the lobe at the very back of your head, is in fact where visual stimuli is sorted out.
Right. That's the yellow one.
That's the yellow one. So stimuli come in your brain through your eyes. It has to travel all the way through your brain to the occipital lobe and get resolved and dealt with there. The other thing with the structures is, besides these lobes, you've got a number of individual places in the brain that you will find get referenced quite a bit when people are talking about different illnesses or different kinds of problems people have. Many of these are locations in the brain, sort of like deep inside the brain. They're not going to be on the outside of the brain. When you think about the way the brain is organized, it comes off your spinal cord. And then you've got what is sometimes referred to as the brain stem, which is the lowest part of the brain. And then what's referred to as the hindbrain, limbic system, and then the cortex. And the idea being, from an evolutionary perspective, that the stuff that is lower down in the brain, and especially in the central part, has been there for a long time.
Is that what we call the reptilian brain?
Reptilian brain, you'll say there's actually a place in the brain called the mammillary body, mammalian brain. And so people, there's some great books out there, the role, I think there's a book on, how we are similar to fish, how we are similar to hamsters. There's been a number of books looking at brain evolution. But some of these areas, things like the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the pineal gland, all these are kind of deep in the center of the brain. And these all have major roles to play in the way that the chemical signals in the brain operate. And the primary assumption in a lot of health, mental health, behavioral health issues is that when things start to go awry, when people start to experience symptoms, that it's either an issue of the structure of their brain, that is the lobes, the white matter of the brain, something's gone amiss, or it's embedded in one of these areas like the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the pineal gland, because those play a role in the production of things like hormones, neurotransmitters, and how the brain's chemical signals fire and get utilized. So from a structural perspective, understanding the role the lobes play, understanding, when someone says something like, is there a connection between depression and the pineal gland? And that has been said, that the pineal gland is
Somebody somewhere said that.
Someone said it. And they've looked at, for example, the pineal gland plays a role in a lot of research on seasonal affective disorder and how your body responds and processes sunlight and why lack of sunlight might trigger some people into seasonal affective disorder. And you will find people referencing the pineal gland for that.
So is that something that social workers should know, what the pineal gland does and like its function? Because social workers do work with folks with seasonal affective disorder. I mean, social workers have seasonal affective disorder. Yes. So is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially that when clients are struggling with understanding why these things are happening, I've always seen it, and this may be just me, but I've always seen it somewhat as trying to destigmatize things. I mean, you're not faking it. It's not always because of something that's totally within your control immediately. So when people are sort of like, I don't know why I'm depressed. I don't know why when October, November rolls around, I can't get out of bed. People are telling me I'm lazy. My boss gets angry because I can't come into work and suddenly my job is on the line. Again, you may want to introduce the idea of, is there a connection here with seasonal affective disorder? Here's what we understand about it. Here are some effective interventions that are based on some of this brain science. So it gives people some hope that there are, in fact, things that can be done, and so that they don't feel, like I said, stigmatized that it's just them being lazy. Or that it's, again, kind of a mysterious thing. You can demystify some of the symptoms your clients are experiencing and give them some sense that there's something that can be done about it.
And as you're talking, it makes me realize that even though we're very clear that social workers, because they're not medical providers, they're not nurses, and therefore they can't talk about medications in the sense that they're prescribing them or anything like that, it doesn't mean they can't talk about the brain, right? And sort of the role of the brain in what's going on with them.
Yeah, because I think the connection here is as social workers become more informed about the brain, and for many social workers, it may be that you don't need to know everything about the brain, but as you work with certain populations more than others, you educate yourself about the research on the brain that impacts that population in particular. I've spent 35 years dealing primarily with people with psychosis. So I tend to read a lot of the literature on schizophrenia and the brain. But other people don't ever work with that population, so they may read the stuff on other things. But there is a real connection between some of the symptoms our clients present with, the role the brain may play in why those symptoms are present, the neurotransmitters that are connected to some of those symptoms, and then why certain medications, in fact, might be used, given how those medications are connected to neurotransmitters, which are connected to parts of the brain. So it fits together. And I find that social workers, because we usually see clients more often than doctors do, we are oftentimes on the front line of working with clients who will say things like, I'm having this symptom and it's getting worse, or the doctor put me on this medication, but I'm now having this reaction to it, that we oftentimes hear this stuff sooner and more frequently than the medical professionals do. And again, we have to be able to respond from a position of knowledge and try to help our clients get a handle on what's going on. Yes, we do not want to be prescribing medications, but we can certainly talk about why certain medications are being entertained. And I've had multiple clients over the years say things like, the doctor wants to start me on medication X. Why? And so we will go over their symptom profile, the research, what this medication is thought to do, and it just tries to demystify the process. And then we can also talk about things that might happen while they're on the medication, side effects and such like that, so that if something starts to go amiss, they're not in the dark as to why.
And it seems like it would be very powerful because you're talking to somebody who's saying, I started taking this medication and now I'm having issues with my vision or my appetite. And if you know the parts of the brain and you know what they do and how the medication is either supposed to tap that or not, then you could talk about it.
The connection here with, again, working with the clients around this is when I mention things about the pineal gland, the hippocampus, the thalamus, those kinds of areas within the brain, all of these are connected to some extent, the way the brain produces and utilizes what are referred to as neurotransmitters. And this is the chemical side of the brain, how the different parts of the brain communicate with each other. Again, you can't see this. When you look at a brain, you don't see this level. We're talking about the function of neurons in the brain, the wiring of the brain.
They're really small.
The really small stuff, which you usually see blown up in really cool illustrations, but it doesn't look like that when you're staring at actual brains. Because really what they're trying to show is, when the brain picks up some kind of stimulus, it starts in this thing called a dendrite, and it moves down what's referred to as an axon, which is, again, kind of the wiring. And the axon is more or less covered in what's referred to as a myelin sheath. It's kind of the protection of the wiring. And this impulse travels down this axon and it gets to what's called a presynaptic terminal. And then there's a space, it's called the synapse. And then it has to jump this space and then move into what's called the postsynaptic terminal and then continue its pathway. What jumps that space, what moves across from the presynaptic terminal to the postsynaptic terminal are the neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are what helps the signals in your brain move efficiently around to get where they need to go. In many cases, and again, there's, a dozen or more neurotransmitters. And for social work purposes, you probably don't even need to know what all of them are. There are popular ones that pop up because of the kinds of things they're related to in terms of symptoms and medications. So things like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, just those three, cover a fair bit of ground. But there are others, GABA and other things that get looked at. But each of these neurotransmitters are in some ways affecting different parts of the brain. And to a large extent, the symptoms arrive when you have either an overabundance or an underabundance of particular neurotransmitters. Because if you flood the system, if you have too much of something, that cuts down on its efficiency. And if you have too little of something, that cuts down on its efficiency. And when the brain has too much or too little of neurotransmitters, it affects how things communicate between the brains. And so then you start to see certain types of symptoms emerge, whether that's things like anxiety, irritability, depression, things like that. What's interesting, and this is oversimplifying it, but it's the best way I can kind of describe it, most medications that people take to treat most of the major mental health issues, those medications primarily trick the brain into adjusting its production of neurotransmitters. So when you take something called, for example, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, like Prozac and things like that.
The SSRIs.
And there's, NSRIs, norepinephrine and serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and a whole variety of medications. Most of those medications are given because the assumption is made the symptoms you're exhibiting are because of a under or overproduction of a neurotransmitter, and this medication will alter the production, either increasing it or decreasing it. The idea being then, if you can get the neurotransmitters back into balance, the symptoms will go away. So when I tell people, it's like, why does the doctor want me to take this medication? And let's say they're being given Prozac for depression. I can talk about the fact that Prozac is thought to affect the production of serotonin, and a misproduction of serotonin is thought to be connected with things like depression. So that's why this medication is being given for this particular thing.
And that's a good example of how a social worker would use this understanding of neurobiology in a very helpful clinical setting.
You want to be able to talk knowledgeably with your clients and ease their concerns or anxieties or address their questions, because they will oftentimes say, why? Why is this being asked of me? Why do we want to do this? What's the benefit of this? Because every medication has side effects. Some medications can be very expensive. And if you can't answer fundamentally, why should I put myself out to do this? We shouldn't be surprised that they are anxious and reluctant to do it.
Right.
So we can at least alleviate some of their anxieties by saying, we're not just guessing. Here's the evidence as to why this might be a good thing to try, given who you are, the kind of symptoms you're experiencing, how those symptoms are tied into these areas of the brain, and how this medication is designed to impact that kind of functioning in the brain. It doesn't necessarily alleviate all their anxieties, but it gives them more information to make an informed decision should they decide to take it or not.
So I've heard about serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, which I can never hear that without thinking of norepinephrine, the when Harry met Sally neurotransmitter. But I know you mentioned that there are many of them. So what are some of the other ones that social workers should know about?
Well, to some extent, I think you mentioned the main ones. Dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine are probably
now you're thinking norepinephrine too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Those are probably the ones that are most common in the literature. And when you start looking at different medications and symptoms, those are the most popular ones. If you take, for example, dopamine as a neurotransmitter, and I had mentioned earlier in terms of structure, one of the structures in the brain, it's more kind of a web in the brain, something referred to as the limbic system. But the limbic system is kind of this interconnected web in the brain, which reaches multiple lobes. So what's interesting is when something starts to go amiss in the limbic system, it can impact a lot of different areas of functioning. And dopamine is influences the limbic system. One of the issues with dopamine is when you've got too much dopamine in your system, when the brain overproduces dopamine, you start to have issues of things like hypervigilance, paranoia, perceptual distortions, things that start to sound a lot like psychotic disorders. And in fact, for a long time, there was what was called the dopamine hypothesis about something like schizophrenia. And when you think about the symptoms of schizophrenia, everything from visual distortions, odd beliefs, speech difficulties, motor difficulties, it would make sense in some ways that something like the limbic system that touches on all these parts of the brain would result in a fairly broad symptom profile. When you look at something like, say, serotonin as a different neurotransmitter, with serotonin, this is connected through the hypothalamus and actually has an impact on many lobes of the brain. But with serotonin, the issue is if you've got, for example, too little serotonin, if your brain produces a lack, there's not sufficient serotonin going on in the brain, you start to have issues of irritability, depression, aggression, things like that. For an example, if we stick with serotonin for a second, if the issue is there's not enough serotonin in the brain, and therefore you have problems, the issue is how do you trick the brain into producing more serotonin?
Yeah.
And so you have these class of medications called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And what these medications essentially do, if you're taking them, is when those neurotransmitters get to that synapse and they're going to make the jump across that little gap, the serotonin moves across that gap. It fills the receptors on the other side of that gap. Now, there may be then serotonin that was extra and wasn't needed. And so things can happen to that extra serotonin. One of the things that can happen is it can get reabsorbed back in the presynaptic, the part of the gap where they left from. So they can get reabsorbed. It's called reuptake. So they can be then used again. Well, if you take a medication called SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, what's happening is that serotonin that is not needed to make the jump across the synapse, the medication blocks its reabsorption. It blocks the reintake. It's the reuptake inhibitor. So when it can't be recycled, the brain thinks, oh, we need to make more. And so a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, by blocking that recycling process, tricks the brain into saying we need more serotonin. If the brain starts pumping up more serotonin, you get more of what you need, and then hopefully those medications would then take away the irritability, take away the depression by, again, tricking the brain into making more serotonin. Similar with norepinephrine, which gets talked about all the time. Here, the issue is if you have too much norepinephrine. If you've got too much norepinephrine going on in your system, you may experience things like anxiety, arousal, irritability, tension, what's sometimes referred to as startle response. These are people oftentimes who just seem like they're constantly sort of on edge. Now, you can also have too little norepinephrine, and then that kind of flips the picture, and then you've got people who are feeling depressed, very kind of low mood, things like that.
Sort of not on edge.
Not on edge, yeah, kind of the reverse of that. So again, when most medications to treat mental health issues are developed, at least now that we're into like our third or fourth generation of medications, most of these medications are being designed to specifically target very specific neurotransmitters, as opposed to old school medications, which just kind of flooded the brain. And so you oftentimes would find different kinds of side effect profiles with older medications than newer medications. But because you're messing with the brain, and all medications mess with the brain, all medications have side effects. And again, I think from a social work perspective, as you learn about the connection between the different parts of the brain, the production of neurotransmitters, how neurotransmitters are tied to particular symptoms, why certain medications would then be used to treat those symptoms, you can educate yourself about the kinds of side effects. Side effects are one of the top reasons why people stop taking medications. So whether it's things like weight gain, sexual issues, appetite issues, dry mouth, blurry vision. I mean, there's a whole host of side effects which are not uncommon. Many of them can be adjusted to or coped with. But again, you need to inform your clients so they can make an assessment of how it's going to impact them. And like I said, most of the time I find social workers are the ones that people complain to side effects first to. So you will have clients coming in saying, I had to go buy glasses because this medication just made my vision blurry. So I had to stop at Walgreens and get reading glasses. How long is this going to last? And you need to be able to talk about that.
I think that really clarifies this distinction between medication and sort of not talking about prescribing medication and that kind of thing, but really talking about the things that people are actually interested in, which is, what is this doing to my brain? Why might I be feeling like this? How come this is interfering with my ability to go to work, to hang out with my friends? What's happening? I thought this medication was supposed to make me feel better, and it's just making me feel these other things.
Right. And that's a key issue because, again, our clients who are, again, looking at us for good interventions, they want to feel better. They want to feel like, their symptoms are being addressed, can easily get very frustrated when the medications that might be offered have a side effect profile that they find intolerable. And again, there's a lot of good information out there. Most of the information I get, because it's a good resource, is I use, NIH, National Institutes of Health, National Institutes of Mental Health, has wonderful web resources on all of the medications, what they are, what they're for, side effects. The thing that I struggle with, though it's online now, there used to be what was referred to as I don't know if you ever remember the physician's desk reference, the PDR.
Yep, sure thing.
And the PDR was sort of a Bible, but a real pain to use. Because I would frequently have clients who would say, well, can you Xerox off the PDR on this medication? And the thing with the physician's desk reference is it had to publish every negative outcome, no matter how few people ever experienced it.
Right. If there was a 5,000 person trial and one person blacked out.
Right.
Yeah.
It's there.
It's there. It's in there.
And so we used to just joke all the time. It's like everything in the PDR, somebody died.
Yeah.
And it's there. And so I'm like, I don't want to Xerox this off for clients. That's more information than they need. And usually when you start digging, you realize this person had a complicated system or immune deficiency, or there was something going on that was not related to the medication.
Yeah.
But if you use NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, they publish wonderful things giving overviews of the medications, what they're targeting. I do think one of the interesting areas that's popped up just within the last year related to neurotransmitters and medication is what's now being referred to as discontinuation syndrome. And this has caught a lot of people by surprise, though I'm starting to see some literature coming out about it. But we oftentimes tell people about the side effects of medication when they're on it. We don't always talk about the side effects they experience when they come off of it. And especially people who just stop cold turkey because of side effects. Most of the time, people will be told, do not stop cold turkey, unless there's some really major complication, like with lithium or something like that.
Like Stephen Johnson.
Where you can get something like lithium toxicity, or with some antipsychotics, there's a condition called agranulocytosis, which could be potentially fatal. But most of the times you're told, if it's not agreeing with you, we will wean you off. But some people just say, I'm stopping because it's so uncomfortable. And then they have a whole flood of side effects because they stopped. And that has driven some people to then start the medication up again because they want to avoid the side effects of coming off of it. And there's now a whole science behind working with clients about how you come off of medication.
Discontinuation.
And there's this thing called discontinuation syndrome. And it's been noted primarily in the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but it's not exclusively in those meds. But for people who stop cold turkey, they will have the equivalent of things like migraines. They'll talk about lightning flashes in the brain, really severe side effects of not taking the medicine. And the dilemma I find is we don't ever talk about that side of the equation. We're always like, when you take this, you might experience this. We need to be much better about saying, and if you want to come off of it, here's the smart way to do it to avoid these things.
Now, is that a conversation that you as the social worker would have, or are you saying this is something that we need to make sure that the prescribing provider has with clients?
I think it's both. I mean, I think we need to be, with the doctors we work with, again, if you're in hospitals, you're working with interdisciplinary teams, if a decision is made that a client ought to start a particular medication, a good question to always ask is, what should we say to this client about potential side effects of that medicine? And is there anything we need to say to this client about the discontinuation of the medicine? And hopefully the team can then figure out what's the appropriate response to those questions, because those questions might come up. And if they don't come up because the client doesn't know to ask them, we shouldn't just ignore it. We should say, you might be wondering.
You should be asking about.
You know, when you see the doctor, ask about these things. Again, I'm not suggesting that social workers substitute for the MD, but we can both be possessors of knowledge as well as advocating for our clients the kinds of questions they need to ask the people who ought to have that knowledge. And that includes side effects both of being on the medication and the side effects of if you choose to come off the medication.
That's really great. I'm really glad that you added that piece, because I think it is a very practical side of talking about medication that I know when I was trained, nobody talked about discontinuation, even though we would see it.
Yeah. And like I said, and I think the dilemma is a lot of individuals who have experienced this discontinuation syndrome. It's sort of the wonders of the technological world and things like YouTube and stuff like that, is I think there are now people out there like doing, what do they call them? Like medication hacks, like do-it-yourself discontinuation. And that makes me a little nervous.
Yes. That
you would take advice from a YouTube video about how to stop taking a medication as opposed to talking to your social worker, your doctor. But I understand the frustration that if there are consumers of these medications who feel like no one has told me about this, they're going to figure out a way. But yeah, knowing that there's sort of like quote unquote medication hacks out there makes me a little nervous.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good note to end this interview on: DIY medication hacks on YouTube.
Avoid them.
Avoid them. Well, Jim, thank you so much for talking with us about neurotransmitters, about parts of the brain, about medication, about why social workers should be more informed about this and what they can do with this information. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.